This is the Grand Prix winning, Ayrton Senna beating 1990 Williams FW13B Formula 1 car. And it's now available as our launch vehicle on private sales. It's the 1990 Hungarian GP winner. Pole and win at Hungary in 1990. Second place at Silverstone. Fourth place Monaco and Jerez. And here it is, the last Formula 1 car designed by Patrick Head, driven by Thierry Boutsen for 14 rounds of the 1990 Formula 1 Championship. Starts off with the cockpit. First of all, it's just tiny in here. This is the last Williams to have a proper manual gear shift. 3 pedals down there, but the packaging is so tight. The steering wheel is tiny. There is an electronics display behind there, but it's an early one for that. And down here, there are 3 stars. 1 for a pole position, 1 for a win, 1 for a second place. It's carbon fibre, which still feels remarkably tough when you wrap it with your knuckles, but it's so pared back compared to a modern Formula 1 car. This is a fully functioning race car. First of all, it comes with a full set of pit equipment and a spare set of wheels. That Renault RS2 3.5-litre V10 masterpiece, that's a runner. The car was fully restored by Williams Heritage. Speaking of which, we've got someone now who knows more about this car than just about anyone else, and his surname just happens to be Williams. So Jonathan, we're sitting right behind it now, and I always think that this era of Williams, with that very, very distinctive livery, about as good as it gets, isn't it? Canon. I probably bought a Canon product on the back of seeing that. So what do you remember about that year?
Primarily, I was in Budapest when it took that great Grand Prix win from pole.
Line, and he claimed his first victory of the year to the delight of the mechanics lining the pit wall. Renault had made a major effort in Hungary, even supplying special qualifying engines, and it had paid off.
Quite often, a car and driver combo that wins at Hungary is the only win of the season, because it's a very particular circuit. It has a very particular demand on the car, doesn't it? Did that suit 13B, basically?
It seemed to suit Williams. But yeah, I mean, there was something about that weekend where perhaps we weren't as competitive in 1990 over the balance of the year as we expected to be. But we came to Budapest, and with Thierry and Riccardo Patrese, we locked out the front row. I think Riccardo was jumped by one of the McLarens at the start, but still that facilitated Thierry getting ahead. And he led the whole way. We weren't pit stopping, others were, so we had to contend with that as the race went on. And Thierry got into a lead at the start that he would never lose. Riccardo, I think, dropped a place to, if memory serves, Gerhard Berger in the McLaren. And then didn't.
When you say memory serves, I've never known you to be wrong.
Well, there's a small chance it was somebody other than Gerhard Berger, but I'm pretty sure it was Gerhard Berger.
Yeah.
But Thierry would go on to lead from start to finish, but that was on a no-stop strategy for tyres, which of course was up to you in those days. You could choose your tyres, and if you thought they could last, you would go for it, and we did. But others behind us some of them were stopping. And I think somewhere within the last 20 laps, a queue formed behind us, and it was Alessandro Nannini in the Benetton second, then Ayrton Senna in the McLaren, Nigel Mansell in the Ferrari, and then in 5th place, Gerhard Berger in the McLaren again. Yeah. And I think those guys were covered by a blanket at that point, and Thierry was just precise, every corner, every apex, every gear change, which of course was a possibility of an error in those days. He was just perfect and didn't flinch, never gave them anything. To the point that you could argue the McLaren drivers got a touch desperate in that queue, because Ayrton Senna eliminated Alessandro Nannini from 2nd place at the chicane, and then, not put off by Ayrton's mistake, several laps later Gerhard Berger tried it and took Nigel Mansell and himself out. So courtesy of McLaren, the queue went from 4 just to 1, but that was Ayrton Senna, which probably meant that we weren't home until we were home. And Ayrton just harried Thierry for the dying laps, but just couldn't find a way past, and they took the checkered flag, probably half a second apart, for a great win.
Nail-biting stuff for the Williams followers as the Brazilian hounded the leader right up to the flag. But Boutsen's skill lasted him to the line, and he claimed his first victory of the year
how many other circuits on the F1 calendar then could have supported that level of defence?
Probably just Monaco.
Yeah.
I mean, they used to say that Budapest is Monaco without the barriers.
Yeah.
I mean, I simply don't think, had there been anywhere other than Budapest, that he would have probably held off that pressure. There is a nice little story to that point, in that on his way to the podium, Patrick Head stopped at the McLaren pit wall and thanked them. And it was tongue-in-cheek, although they didn't initially realise it, because they took Patrick at face value to mean, thank you for Ayrton not overtaking us. And Patrick corrected them and said, no. Thank you for crashing Alessandro Nannini out of the race. Because of all the guys in the queue behind us, he was the one who looked like he was going to get us. That Benetton, incredibly nimble, turning on a dime. And probably if you hadn't crashed him out, he probably would have got us. So thank you.
So after Hungary, maybe the media thought, actually, there's someone else in this other than just McLaren. There's another potential car here that can win races. You go to Spa.
Yes.
What happens then?
Well, the home Grand Prix, of course, for Thierry Boutsen. So winning last time out in Budapest, that ups the interest and a little bit of pressure. Although there was one great moment. Unfortunately, that was a 3-start Grand Prix. It took 3 attempts to get the 1990 Belgian Grand Prix going because of start line accidents. And on one of them, Thierry in this car, fantastic launch, went from 4th to 2nd by the time they got to turn 1, and came past me watching on the outside of that corner, right on Ayrton's gearbox, and it was, right, here we go. And then a few seconds later, red flag. And that was, unfortunately, as good as it got. We didn't finish that race, but there were points finishes, I think, in the Spanish, Japanese, Australian Grand Prix for Thierry in this car. But Budapest was as good as it got. But there was, as you say, there was certainly quite a bit of, well, when you sort of have that Grand Prix win, as we had with Pastor Maldonado all those years later, where a win was a bit of an oasis to us. Yeah. It certainly makes you feel, right, we can do it again. It gives you that sort of boost. They always do. Yeah. But we didn't quite. We'd won earlier in the year with Riccardo Patrese and a sister FW13B, so we only took 2 wins that year. But certainly Budapest was, it was a high point, really.
In current Formula 1, anyone that wins 2 races would be over the moon. It'd be like winning a championship, wouldn't it? In current Formula 1.
It's all relative. When I used to show people around the museum at Williams, I'd get to 1995, which was a 5-win, second in both championship season. And I would talk about it with quite a downer on, because it was a blip, because the 3 seasons before won all the Constructors' Championships, and the 2 years after won all the championships with the Patrick Head, Adrian Newey designed Renault V10 powered cars. So winning 5 Grand Prix and being runners-up was actually quite a blip in 1995. But 10, 20 years later, that would have been from the gods if Williams had achieved that. But it's all relative.
So there's an apocryphal story about this car, and this doesn't have to be broadcast unless you want it to. Someone told me that at the end of the season, someone bolted our Nige into this thing to see whether it was the car that was lacking performance, and maybe that you didn't have absolutely top-tier drivers. This is no disrespect to Thierry Boutsen or to Mr. Patrese, but is it true that Nigel went in it and went quite quick in it?
Yes. Nigel tested FW13Bs over the winter of 1990 to 91, at first Estoril in Portugal and then on to Paul Ricard in France. And I think it might have been at the latter where he himself in a Ferrari had set pole for the French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard in 1990. And I think he went not only massively quicker than that, but massively quicker than the FW13B had ever gone around Paul Ricard. You could argue that in the winter, perhaps the engine, the track conditions might be a little bit better. Ricard was always a sweltering Grand Prix. But I think Patrick Head is on record somewhere as saying he sat in his airline seat on the flight home and he thought, we wasted 1990. There was certainly a lot left on the table than the 2 wins and the 2 other podiums.
So had you had a Nigel, it might have been different.
It probably would have been different. I mean, I think with regard to any driver, having Nigel Mansell in the car was always different. I mean, no 2 great drivers are exactly the same. And Nigel Mansell was, in terms of his contemporaries, he was different to an Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost and Nelson Piquet. So having Nigel in the car was a luxury that's surprisingly rare in racing. I'm sure that Red Bull know they have it right now, but it's a very rare thing. Yeah. And having Nigel in the car, you never, ever doubted. You knew exactly what your car was and where your car was when you had Nigel Mansell in it.
How do you think a Patrick Head views this sort of object now? Is it just another mark on the career? Is it another footnote of what they've achieved? Or do you think there's a fondness? Do they see the stories? Do they see the battles? Does it act as a kind of metaphor or a reminder of that time in their life? I wonder what they think.
I think if Patrick were here now, I think there would be fondness, but I think it would be fondness of learnings. That would be how he would retrospectively wax lyrical if he were present with us. He would talk about the significant moments of FW13B. So he would talk about the successes on track, but he would also talk about the cresting of Renault as a force to take on and surpass Honda as the standard setter for engine performance in Formula One. He would probably also talk about the recruitment of Adrian Newey in the summer of 1990, and he would probably say he was rather surprised that he had that opportunity to make that recruitment, because Adrian Newey was dismissed by Leighton House after the failure of their cars to qualify for the Mexican Grand Prix that year. Of course, 2 weeks later, they nearly won the French Grand Prix. So
historically, not the wisest recruitment move in history.
Apparently it was made by an accountant or a lawyer, and if there are any of them watching, I apologise, but apparently it was made by an accountant or a lawyer by telephone in Japan.
Imagine?
But that's apparently how it was made, so...
I find it a beautiful car to look at. I really do.
It really is.
It's stunning. And also, because you'll have all this in your head, because you are the mainframe when it comes to these things. What was the last season that a manual gear shift car raced against a paddle shift car?
From a Williams point of view, this was the last Williams manual before paddle shift, and it was H-pattern. So we went straight from H-pattern, 6-speed to semi-automatic. We jumped sequential, if sequential was ever.
So you never had sequential lever in the car? You went straight to buttons or paddles?
Exactly.
Did you?
Yeah. So this was the last time, and this was the second Formula One car to make that step. Ferrari pioneered it in 1989 with a John Barnard design car that of course won on its debut despite being incredibly troublesome. So that miraculous, fantastic Brazilian Grand Prix of Nigel Mansell's in 1989. And then we followed suit 2 years later. I was sort of reminiscing earlier, and we go back to that Adrian Newey recruitment, and I think Patrick's on record as saying it took me only a few weeks of Adrian's arrival to realise that he was more suited to being chief designer of the car than Patrick was at the time. So Patrick vacated his role of chief designer and gave that to Adrian and promoted himself to being technical director. Upon which, not long after, Adrian came into Patrick's office and said, the gearbox is too big for what I want. In FW14, the gearbox is simply too big. So at Adrian's request, Patrick locked himself in his design office for 6 weeks and just drew a new gearbox in 6 weeks to Adrian's dimensions, and then found a way to make his mechanicals work. And that's really the trick, that you can be hugely successful in the present, but what you're actually building behind the scenes and layering behind the scenes is sort of protecting and future-proofing that success for years ahead. And probably if Patrick were here now, he would point to FW13B in 1990 being a huge part of that for Williams, because it opened the gates to the cars that he and Adrian designed in the 1990s that just for pretty much 7 years set the standard.
Yeah. I wonder how good it would sound. You've probably heard it.
I've heard it.
It's a great noise, isn't it?
It is, yeah. There's a range of V10s. And I think this is just a beautiful sort of growl of a V10, I find. And then you get towards the end of our V10s, which of course for Williams meant BMW.
They started to shriek.
The scream, 20,000 RPM engines. I mean, around Monza, Juan Pablo Montoya, those laps. But I think these early V10s, after turbos, it was a bit of a back to what we know and back to where we should be.
Yeah.
And the sound of those late 80s, early 90s cars were just absolutely glorious. Now,
normally, I wouldn't be excited about the fact that a book comes with an expensive racing car, but this is not an ordinary book, is it? This is a lot of research.
This is, and a lot of research, but this was the fun part. This was going into the archive at Williams and just finding a wide range of documents that were relevant to not only FW13B, but specifically to Chassis 8. So run sheets, as we called them, green sheets, setup sheets, technical documents, memos, original drawings. I mean,
So this is. I have to interrupt because it's so cool. If you're a nerd like me,
Unlike me.
Yeah, 1990. This is Silverstone race.
Yep.
We've got a setup sheet here that gives us everything: toe, camber, dampers, wheels, caster, roll bars, brake ducts. I mean, it's just.
As you can see, they had different specifications of brake ducts, so they chose different from front to rear.
Diff, everything.
Everything on it, yeah.
As a nerd out.
And this is on a race-by-race basis, so it's laid out, some of the chapters are laid out race by race, so you have documents relative to where we are now, the British Grand Prix, and then it goes on to the next Grand Prix. And this car being a 14-time Grand Prix racer, it's going to have an awful lot of data, which of course in this day and age was less so compiled by computer and more by hand and typewriter, as we can see here. So this is
the itinerary. So you have manifest of who's travelling to the
who went to which Grand Prix.
It's your father, Patrick Head,
Sheridan Finn.
Look at those.
I was there, but I wasn't actually playing a role, hence I don't appear on it.
Crumpler, what a great surname.
Gary Crumpler.
Crumpler.
He was in marketing.
I just love the fact that it tells the story of the car in the most minute detail. In fact, now you've seen this, one of these isn't complete without one of these to go with it, is it?
I would like to think not. I mean, this was something that myself and my colleagues at Williams Heritage took a great deal of pride and fascination and learnings.
And most importantly, that book comes with that car.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Pleasure.
What a beautiful car. If you're interested, please contact us.